Hello, and welcome back to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name's William Gibson. I am your current host, although my time is quickly coming to an end. But today I'm delighted to be speaking with our guest, Grace Thomas. Welcome to the podcast, Grace.
Hi, it's really good to be here.
So Grace is the Canon Missioner at Manchester Cathedral, as well as the Diocesan Environment Officer and Associate Tutor at Luther King Centre. Grace's publications include a chapter on ecological grief in Words for a Dying World, a chapter about female clergy, wellbeing and female faith practices, a co-edited book called Chaplaincy, Contemporary and Global Perspectives, and a co-authored Grove book entitled Climate Action as Mission. Grace is passionate about justice, especially in areas of climate, ethnicity, and poverty. She is the chair of the charity Greater Together Manchester and is the Northern Province Clergy Rep for AMEN, which seeks to support Anglicans of minority ethnic heritage. And Grace regularly presents Radio 4's daily service. Also from JPIT today, we have Thomas Niblett joining again. Good to see you, Thomas.
Aye.
So we'll start with our first and most regular question for you, Grace. Does politics belong in the pulpit?
Well, it'd be pretty bad if I said it didn't, given the kind of the theme of the podcast. What I would say is, yes, it does, in the sense that politics is about how we structure our lives, how where our resources go, who is prioritised, and all that kind of thing. What I would say is that when it comes to things like party politics, you've got to be a bit more careful. In the pulpit, you are in a position of power, and there's some nuance that you need to be aware of in that. So yes, absolutely, politics, it belongs in the pulpit, but how we navigate that is really important.
Yeah, I agree. So let's set some context before we get into the readings and our conversations for today. It is the 4-year anniversary since Russia invaded Ukraine. Donald Trump's new global tariffs have been implemented at 10%. Peter Mandelson has been released on bail after arrest for misconduct in the public office. And ongoing violence is occurring across Mexico following the recent killing of the country's drug lord El Mencho. Obviously, we are recording this a little bit before the week that we're talking about, which is Sunday, the 8th of March. So these might be slightly out of date. So do engage with whatever's going on right now as you're listening, and check out your newspapers and see what is going on. Our lectionary readings are from Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 to 7, Psalm 95, Romans 5, verses 1 to 11, and our gospel reading is John chapter 4, verses 5 to 52. So a big, chunky, long reading at the end there, which I think we'll end up spending a good bit of time talking about because there's a lot in there for today. And with Awareness Days, we have Lent. We're well and truly on our way through Lent now. On the 8th of March, we also have International Women's Day, the National Day of Reflection for people bereaved by COVID, and the International Day for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. So with all of that in mind, then let's have a look at the text. So Grace, is there a passage that you would pick to preach from here, or a theme across the lectionary text more broadly? And then after that, we'll get into each of the passages and have a chat.
Well, absolutely, yes. I mean, you mentioned it's International Women's Day on the day that this we would be, preaching on these passages. So I'm immediately drawn to the gospel reading where we have Jesus encountering the woman at the well. So for me, I think there's so much richness in that passage. You said it was an incredibly long passage. There's lots of richness. There's lots of ways in which you can tie in with issues that are going on today. So for me, if I was preaching, which I might be actually, that is the passage that I would probably hone in on, given that it's International Women's Day as well.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, we will end with our reading from the Gospels, but we will work our way through the other ones first of all. So let's start with our Exodus reading, chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. Grace, what did you take away from this passage?
I find this a really interesting passage in that you've got um, the Israelites have been freed, they're wandering, they're journeying, and there is this, they are thirsty. I mean, this is quite a natural thing for them. They are thirsty, and they're asking, they're saying to Moses, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt, only for us to basically die of thirst or starvation?" And Moses seems a little bit kind of like, "Why are you putting me to the test? And why are you putting God to the test?" And there's a little bit of like this tension that goes on. But then Moses cries out to the Lord, "What shall I do with these people?" And the Lord provides water, and they are refreshed. I mean, for me, I guess the really interesting thing here is the human nature kind of aspect of this. You can really imagine, you can really see how this is happening. You can see the call of the people. You can see the frustration of Moses, who has done so much, but then you see the provision of God.
Definitely. And I mean, I really picked up on that line that you mentioned there, Grace, of the why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us? Because it feels like very strong language when you're comparing it to the slavery that they experienced in Egypt. And I've heard people talk about this passage and the lack of water, where the point being drawn from it is about the ancient Israelites lacking faith in God to provide despite seeing the miracles that brought them out of Egypt. But throughout human history, as well as today, access to water is a primary need, and a lack of water does, in fact, lead to death, migration, communities collapsing. So, according to UNICEF, 4 billion people, almost two-thirds of the world's population, experience severe water scarcity for at least 1 month each year. Over 2 billion people live in countries where water supply is inadequate. Some 700 million people could be displaced by intense water scarcity by 2030. And by 2040, roughly 1 in 4 children worldwide will be living in areas of extremely high water stress. So when I read this passage, I actually find myself frustrated with Moses' response. Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? The people's request and question is reasonable.
Yeah.
Moses even goes on to name the place Massa, meaning test, and Meribah, meaning quarrel. And the passage says that the ancient Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord. And with hindsight and with lack of experience of water scarcity, it can make sense to just say that they didn't trust God enough to provide. But I find myself empathizing with the ancient Israelites in this story. And it's something that maybe we need to keep in mind, especially as it's Lent. If you're fasting, if you're not, if you have given up some sort of food, whatever it is, then thinking about those who are without and not viewing it through this sort of idealized lens of it just being about faith, but recognizing real need in communities. Thomas, is there anything else you would pull out from this passage here?
Yeah, I think along the same lines, that thinking about water as life or kind of renewal, being thirsty for God, and it's such a common kind of motif to have, running water flows, and kind of really seeing and finding God in different sorts of water. I think that's really what it made me think about, and the idea of water spontaneously coming out of a rock is quite an amazing answer to a need, and I'd like to see that as a metaphor as well for the kind of suddenness of God's presence, of the water suddenly appears. God can suddenly appear in our lives, and I think you can hold that reading and also, as you say, William, really think about the practical effects of water scarcity and increasing water scarcity. And it's one of those passages that really helps us put ourselves in the shoes of who is being described in the Bible. We all know what it's like to be thirsty. It's something really universal, and it's really powerful to hold on to those bits of the Bible that feel really applicable today because they're universal human experiences of being thirsty. Um, yeah, and that's what I take away.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So let's move on to our next Hebrew Bible reading in Psalm 95. Grace, what did you think of this?
Well, again, we see echoes, don't we, of the Exodus story coming through this, especially at the end when your ancestors tested me and put me to proof, though they've seen my work. So there's references back to that Exodus reading. It starts though with this call to worship, this joy. Come, let us sing to the Lord, make a joyful noise, and a recognition of the whole of creation being in and from God. You know, in his hand are the depths of the earth. There's such poetry in that. The heights of the mountains, the sea is his, and his hands have formed the dry land. There's such depth in these words and poetry, and I think there's a real juxtaposition here, isn't there? Because we've got this call to worship, and then we've got this reminder of that time in the desert where there is little water, or maybe where we're feeling, thirsty and we're not being sustained. And how do we, continue to worship? How do we continue to give glory to God in those moments, those desert moments when we don't have the things that sustain us? And it takes us back to where you were talking before, William, about that sensitivity, about recognizing the real human need that we have for water, the real human need that we have, and maybe the gentleness about not judging when people may be a bit grumpy when they don't have what they have, even though we are called to worship the Lord at all times.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe there's a call here to recognize that God has provided abundantly. You pulled out those bits that talk about the depths of the earth, the heights of the mountain, the sea, and the dry land are all God's. And in one of the more recent papal encyclicals from Pope Francis and Pope Leo that they co-authored, they remind us that the world's resources are meant for all. They belong to God, and God has given us them as a gift. And the problem arises with unjust distribution of these resources. So, on one end of the spectrum, we have billions of people experiencing water scarcity. And on the other end, we have AI data centers and golf courses consuming massive amounts of water. So, God can certainly and has certainly provided water for all from the abundance of his creation. But we might need to strike a few rocks like Moses first for there to be just distribution. Thomas, what did you take from this?
I really I really like the phrase in my translation anyway, sheep of his hand, that we are the sheep of his hand. I think that's really nice and playing with the metaphor of sheep in a way that's really interesting because I think sometimes we're so familiar with it and it can sometimes be a bit individualizing, I think, to think of ourselves as sheep. If we think of ourselves as individual sheep, we're all individual people. But actually here sheep is very much plural, that there's lots of sheep in his hand and God holds all of us and we're all kind of one mass of people. And I really like that reference towards kind of community, the community of God. And I think I like the what you were saying about worship and thinking about how do we kind of worship at all times, and that can be a real
Mm.
pressure, and especially in Lent I think it can feel like something we can never do and are set up to fail. But I like that the first half reminds us that we aren't set up to fail. God isn't setting us up to feel guilt. God is in a relationship with us that is about praise, salvation, glory, grace, and holding on to that is really important. I think one of the national days that we mentioned is bereavement, the people being bereaved by COVID, and I'd like to think that this psalm is one that would suit really well to speaking to people who have been bereaved. Because it's got those elements of community, togetherness, but also the tests that we might happen that for 40 years. I loathe that generation, the anger, the final line, they shall not enter my rest. I'm sure lots of people who have had loved ones lost from COVID who now feel that society has moved on. And we don't talk about COVID very much, and we don't think about long COVID, and it's not in the headlines, probably feel a bit anger and don't feel able to rest. And I hope that they can relate in their relationship to God to that feeling.
Yeah. Right. We will move on to our New Testament readings and start with Romans chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. Grace, what did you take from this passage?
Now we start this passage with a reminder that we're justified by faith, that we have peace with God through Jesus, through whom we've obtained access to his grace. And it's a real reminder. It's something that I was preaching about a few weeks ago, about this reminder that we We are justified through the grace and love and mercy of God through Jesus. It's not about how many good deeds we do, or how much better we are, or how much status we have above, or how much holier we might be. We are justified through that grace and love and mercy. And so often we can find examples where people want to elevate themselves and sort of give an impression of them being more justified or more holy or more righteous than somebody else. And passing judgment on people's actions and saying, that they are not as worthy and not as, but really what we have here is very clearly saying we are justified through the love, grace, and mercy of Jesus Christ, of God through Jesus Christ, and that's what really matters. The bit that I struggle with comes next, which is the boasting through our sufferings and sufferings producing endurance. And I think we can all understand how suffering, we all go through those really difficult times, and we possibly come out stronger, come out a little bit wiser as a result. But we mustn't undermine the difficulty of suffering. And again, Thomas, it comes back to the point you were making about the National Day of Bereavement for COVID. This is, to suffer is a really, really difficult and bleak thing. And we must not make light of that. So I think there's always that tension between reminding ourselves how much, how we can gain and learn and grow through difficult times, but mustn't remember how difficult it is for people who are in those suffering moments and those suffering times, and not try and undermine or diminish what they are experiencing.
Yeah, definitely. That reminds me of there's this great song by the musician John Mark McMillan called "The Road, the Rocks, and the Weeds," and in it he says, "I've got no answers for hurt knees or cancers, but a Savior who suffers them with me, singing goodbye Olympus. The heart of my Maker is spread out on the road, the rocks, and the weeds." And I think it's so important that when people are suffering, that we recognize that we're not there to come with answers or logic, but rather maybe with what is mentioned at the start of this passage of God's great love for us, that through Jesus we have been made right with God, and to participate in that ministry of reconciliation, which is God's action through Jesus. And that's what I picked out of this passage, was that theme of reconciliation, because it's recognized as a central theme in the Christian story, and it's a great reminder to us that we are meant to be reconcilers too, and helping others realize that their reconciliation to God, but also to reconcile with one another. In 2 Corinthians, Paul tells us that this message of reconciliation has been entrusted to us, and that we, through Christ, have been given the ministry of reconciliation. And this is important work in the world that we live in. Reconciliation often seems harder than ever with our divided algorithms, our lack of a shared reality or vision for the future, but is a work that we are called to nonetheless. And if you were to focus on that theme of reconciliation, it might be a good place to bring up the International Day for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. What you will often see is people will argue against nuclear disarmament because they'll say, well, we can't even begin to have a conversation with our enemies about this sort of thing. But in reality, the work of reconciliation is difficult, it's hard, it will be hard conversations, but it needs to be a vision that we put forward, especially as followers of Jesus. Thomas, what did you take from Romans?
Yeah, there's a couple of bits. I think that idea of reconciliation, definitely, and thinking about disarmament, and the reconciliation is a gift from God. That's really really stark at the end there. That it's something we are reconciled to each other, and we are reconciled to God, and that's actually something that's again something we have in common with God, and our experience of God is the Trinity as a model is really helpful in thinking about how we are both separate and together at once, and we are individual people, but we're also very much part of our communities and part of our relationships in ways we maybe can't quite explain ourselves, how we feel so close to other people, to loved ones, and also to strangers. And that's a bit like the mystery of the Trinity, I would say. Also, I think reconciliation very much about nuclear disarmament and war. But at JPIT, we're also thinking about reconciliation, kind of nationally and around our national politics of division that you mentioned, William, and thinking about responding to authoritarianism and extremism and divisiveness and how we can find shared hope. You listeners might be interested in a recent campaign that's being launched called A Million Acts of Hope, backed by a lot of friends of JPIT, and looking towards a new national story of hope and reconciliation. And I think that's something that's very timely. I'd also think about there's a particular phrase in my translation in verse 6 that Christ died for the ungodly, which I think is really interesting. That we're all ungodly. It's something that maybe unites us. We're all weak and ungodly, and those are quite negative terms. And yet we know we're made in God's image, and that we have power through that, and we have the capacity to love through that. And that makes us equal within God and under God, at those different scales or those different levels of God's presence. And again, comes back to the fact that we actually can reconcile with differences, and something Christians can really bring to conversations about national division and reconciliation and disenfranchisement is that we believe all people have the capacity to love each other, reconcile, because we're all equal under God and in God. We're all ungodly and godly. I think I would take that into the work we're all doing locally and nationally and internationally around peace building, reconciliation, thinking about renewal.
Yeah, it actually makes me think of, I don't know if either of you have done the Iona community daily worship before or anything like that, but part of it is this lovely affirmation that talks about with the whole church, we affirm that we are made in God's image, befriended by Christ, empowered by the Spirit. And then there's a second section that just says that with people everywhere, we affirm God's goodness at the heart of humanity, planted more deeply than all that is wrong. And I think that story of hope that you're talking about, Thomas, is so important because it can feel very bleak at points, but recognizing that God has placed within us that capacity for hope, for love, for justice is so important. So let's go on to our main passage for today then. John chapter 4, verses 5 to 42. Grace, let's hear some of your thoughts on this.
So this is a very long passage, and I'm going to make it even longer because I'm actually going to look at what's happened just before as well.
Yep.
Because in the previous chapter in John 3, Jesus has an encounter with Nicodemus. Nicodemus is the member of the Jewish ruling council, and this encounter happens at night under the protection of darkness because the protection for Nicodemus, in case people might disapprove about him going to this strange person who's speaking all these strange things. So he goes under the cover of night. But then we have this encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well in the height of the day. It's fully exposed. She has no protection. There is no shadow. She is fully vulnerable and exposed. And she is a foreigner. And she is excluded. And as we hear as the reading goes on, there is judgment because of her gender and because of her status. So that juxtaposition to begin with is a really interesting juxtaposition. The two encounters that happen quite close to one another. But what happens in this encounter is there's so much here. The encounter is quite scandalous in societal ways, and the woman notes the scandal of this conversation, in this conversation at the very beginning. How is it that you, she says to Jesus, how is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a Samaritan woman? So she notes that break in convention, and we see how boundaries and expectations are broken in this encounter. And then Jesus has this wonderful, discussion about water. We come back to that theme of water, living water, and says that the water he gives is living water. And she says, give it to me so I won't be thirsty. And then Jesus says, go call your husband. And she says, well, I have no husband. To which Jesus says, I know. You have 5 husbands, but you had 5 husbands, but the one you lived with is not your husband. Again, there's a scandal here, but note that Jesus does not pass moral judgment. He simply states the facts. There's no judgment being given by Jesus. And there's so many ways you could go with this. I mean, it's such a detailed passage, but it's such a beautiful and intimate encounter. It's
Yeah.
just two of them present, both of them, and both of them give of themselves. They name who they are in order to understand one another. When we're talking about reconciliation, there's this conversation that happens between two people from very different backgrounds. They talk, they question, they listen, and this is a real space of understanding, of mutual respect, which is nurtured gently and beautifully. And if we think about how the woman has been defined, and she defines herself by her gender and her status in society, we see that when the disciples respond to her, why are you speaking to her? But Jesus, well, what they want to say, I should say, is why are you speaking to this woman? They don't say it. But Jesus compels her into this conversation, nevertheless, that allows her identity to be refocused. And because she is then seen as this evangelist, this witness, a disciple, in that meaning of being a student of Jesus who goes out and proclaims the good news, the word that, this I've met the Messiah. He is the living water that has given new life to this woman. And it's just an incredible encounter. And one of the things that really struck me throughout this is how sad, the way in which her status, gender, the fact that she has been married 5 times, and we know back in that day that wouldn't have been a choice of hers. Let's be very clear here. She wouldn't have had a choice in a lot of this. This would have been bestowed upon her. And so her subjugation, the discrimination is normalized within the society that she is. And of course, we are speaking on International Women's Day, and which campaigns for equal rights for women and recognition for women across the world, which is still very much needed today. One news story that I wasn't aware of, and that was brought to my attention by a colleague, was the fact that in Afghanistan just a couple of days ago, there was a new penal code enacted that meant that men could physically punish their wives and children as long as they don't break bones or leave open wounds. And that's a very extreme, horrific way of injustice. But it sort of, it reminds us of the ways in which women continue to have their rights and worths undermined, and the way in that's normalized in some societies. And we see this in the woman, the judgment, the potential, the fact that she's at the well at noon because she can't go when the other women go and it's nicer to go. And what Jesus does is Jesus transforms that, and with his living water transforms her afresh. And I just think it's such a beautiful encounter for that.
Yeah, and I like that you picked up the fact that it's normalized, because it's also normalized in a lot of parts of the church too. And there's a real need for us to recognize that actually there is an abundance of evidence of things like the ordination of women and the involvement of women in leadership in the early church throughout church history, that our understanding of what it means to be ordained has developed throughout history. We have a far better understanding of household codes and things like that from the Greco-Roman period, than that the very few and select passages that are often used to subjugate as if they speak entirely to the theology on women in the New Testament just do not justify the treatment of women within the church and all of the extra things when it comes to the family life and structures as well. So this passage, it can be a really empowering one of recognizing the way that Jesus just breaks down all of the expectations, breaks down all of those accepted forms of injustice and inequality. And that's really what I picked up on as well. And maybe to connect it with what you were saying about the Psalms and the sort of call to worship, there's also the mention of worshipping in spirit and truth, that true worship is not determined by place, by location, by people group, by gender, but rather by worshipping in spirit and truth. And the whole story feels very relevant to the message of reconciliation spoken about in Romans. Jesus here is actively doing the work of reconciliation, helping the Samaritan woman to reconcile not only to God, but also to her community, because she goes back into her community, and also to the community of Jews that maybe she had certain perception of, and Jesus begins to break those down. And to quote Desmond Tutu, if you want peace, you don't talk to your friends, you talk to your enemies. So Jesus here overcomes the cultural designation of a Samaritan as enemies and empowers the woman at the well, who goes on to tell her community of this Jesus who offers living water. And the passage tells us that many believed because of the woman's testimony. So I think it's a really powerful passage. I do really love this story. And also, I like the way that you brought in John 3 there, because actually, our guest last week, Reverend Terry Peterson from the Church of Scotland, was speaking on John 3 and Nicodemus, and she brought in John 4 to say these are connected when talking about day and night aspect of it. I think also there's the part in John 3 where it talks about being born of water, and then the living water being spoken about here. So there's so many connections that are brought up there that are definitely worth exploring. Thomas, is there anything you would want to add here?
Yeah, well, I was recommended by Giles Goddard actually at a course at St John's Horsley last year. There's a book by Judith K. Jones, The Women in the Gospel of John. And that talks about lots of similar encounters where all of the encounters Jesus has with women, and there's a lot more than you might first think when you actually count them, are really radical in the way that they upend social norms, as you were saying, William. There's an awful lot of, and you can see this in some of the artistic depictions of lots of these. So from the wedding at Cana with Mary and Martha, with Mary seeing Christ as the gardener after his resurrection. All of these depictions in art often have them as equal height or equal status, and that signifies the kind of closeness with the rest of the crowd, especially in this example in the background, looks really normal to us. But we have to remember just that is completely out of the ordinary, and a very, very big move towards reconciliation, as you say, William. And I think the point is that women are key to the story being heard in the first place. That lots and lots of these characters we see in the Gospel of John, especially who are women, are really important for Jesus to make his points. That there's no way that you can tell the gospel story and the resurrection story, crucially, without the role of women being recognized. So I think that's a really important thing to point out. And it mattered, the gender and sex of the women at this point. It was really important. It couldn't have just been any Samaritan. It was a Samaritan woman. And that is a really important part that we should remember. Because again, it can be such a normal, everyday part of the Bible for us to read, as a gospel, that we forget, we become over familiar. And it's really helpful to actually distance ourselves and remember what it would have been like in the crowd. That's the other important character in this story, as well as the Samaritan woman and Jesus, is the rest of the crowd with the disciples in, going, "What on earth is going on here? What is he doing?" And then, as we know at the end, so many have come to know Jesus because of what she did. That shows you the importance of the onlooker as well. And it might be helpful to imagine, where are we in this story? And I think a lot of us in the day-to-day, we're in the crowd going, how can Jesus do this radical thing? And it's important for us to reflect on that.
Yeah. And there's this great book which I come back to quite regularly. It's very small, but is relevant for Lent because it's just called The Women of the Passion by Margaret Ives. And it's looking at the women of the New Testament and how they tell their stories. And basically, there are reflections for throughout the liturgical calendar. So you have like Advent, Ordinary Time, but you do have Lent as well. So there are readings, reflections, and prayers for Ash Wednesday, for all of like one, I think, for each week of Lent, and then you've got multiple in Holy Week. But it's this great little book with great reflections on women and the Gospels. So maybe something to put a little bit of money in for International Women's Day, get that, and start including more of the stories of the women of the New Testament in your preaching. Before we close, Thomas, do you have any concluding thoughts or anything else you'd want to add to just the overall theme of this week?
I think we've really thought about sort of reconciliation, and actually drawn that out of all the readings. There's definitely a thinking about relationships and struggle in relationships, and that might be in between people, or it might be between us and God, or a community of believers in God. And actually, there's a lot of themes there of really thinking about reconciliation and in the days as well that we've been talking about around bereavement and International Women's Day and disarmament and non-proliferation. Lots of themes of kind of there's been a harm, and how can we as the church work to reconcile and upend that harm as well? I think it's valid for us to use quite strong language around we want to overturn the social norms, much like Jesus did. So I'd take that away.
Yep. And what about you, Grace? Any closing thoughts here for today?
Yeah, I think the theme of reconciliation and community and how we live in community with one another and in community with God is, again, we see themes of that throughout. And one of the things that I was really struck by in the gospel reading is we must remember that, there's a reason this was put in the scriptures. There's a reason this was recorded. Jesus had many encounters, and what we see recorded in the scriptures is really important for us to take note of. And so this really scandalous encounter that we have, but the way in which there's such gentleness and respect that goes on within this encounter, I think is a model for us in our encounters today. Just as a side note, I'm in Manchester, and over the weekend we had Britain First marching through our streets. And there's a real question about how do we engage, how do we encounter, how do we start that process of reconciliation? Are there places where we can have those conversations where we can listen and talk to one another? And I just feel that there's so much in this simple encounter at the well at noon that can speak into so many of the issues that we have today.
Well, thank you so much, Grace, for all of your reflections, and thank you, Thomas, as well. And thank you for listening. And I hope that this episode helps you in your preaching preparation for this Sunday. If you enjoyed this episode, then please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. But as we close today, let us not close our ears to those who cry out for water and who struggle for life. May we, like the psalmist, recognize that all of creation belongs to God. We have no right to hoard its resources, and may we work for a just distribution of life's essentials. Like Paul, let us praise God because we have been reconciled to God through Christ, and may we partake in that ministry and work of reconciliation, reconciling all of creation to God and reconciling with one another. May we come to discover the gift of living water given freely to all, not limited by our group identities, whether racial, ethnic, gendered, or national. May we respond to God with worship in spirit and in truth. Have a good one.